Hello again, and welcome back to another video build. This time around, it's a big one. I'm making the Tyrant King Thanos, and I really hope you enjoy it. So it's finally time to make the big guy. And I do believe this is going to be one of my biggest and most detailed prop builds so far. All in all, I've been working on this guy for about 3 to 4 months now. That's why this video is going to run a little bit longer than usual. And because this time, I wanted to show more of the details at a length. Having said that, we're going to jump in at the point where everything starts to get a bit more interesting. It's the point where everything is sanded. For days, I might add. Some of the parts are printed in ABS filament, some are printed in PLA, and as for the most detailed pieces, it's all printed in resin. And then everything is given a couple of coats of primer, wet sanded, and then it's all ready for the paint job. And just as if it wasn't enough details to this build already, I decided to add even some more. 'Cause why not? The goal was to make a huge statue, diorama, maquette type thing that also would tell a story. So I found some more 3D models that would add to the storytelling. There were these incredibly detailed skulls I found. And it just wouldn't be right having him in full armor without his helmet. Now that's perfect for what the tyrant would be standing on. You know, having crushed them all and stuff. And although it's a resin print, they still need some preparations. Which in this case is pretty straightforward. There's of course the usual sanding and priming, but then it gets a bit more interesting. Using a Dremel with different bits, and some small metal files, I kinda took them apart again. Partially, that is. And as you can tell, the goal was to make them look all battered up from battle, which they obviously lost this round. Yeah, I never found that one again. I always like to try out the parts together, just to make sure it looks good and everything is in the correct relation to each other. The base was printed in 4 different parts and then glued together. And even at 0.12 layer height, you can clearly see the layer lines, which is something I really don't care for. But instead of spending days on end with sanding this piece, I decided to combine it with adding some air drying clay. This is actually something I've done from time to time. It's a way of saving time and adding a personal touch to the build. If you want some more details on how I do this, you should check out my dragon eggs build. Those dragon eggs were fully made with a combination of PLA prints and modeling clay. And then, after about 24 hours, the clay is fully cured. This is when I lightly go over it again with a sanding stick, just to sharpen up some of the edges. This adds the right texture and makes it even more rock-like. And with everything fully prepared, we can move on to the paint job. And that usually starts off with a base coat. And in this case, in addition to his steel blades, Thanos really has a thing for gold. And that makes it natural to start with a black undercoat, so as to get that shiny chrome finish in the end. The base for the skulls, however, would be a kind of bleak bone color. And having learned it the hard way, repeatedly, I finally have the patience to let the paint not only dry out, but to leave it for a whole day to fully cure. And that makes it the perfect canvas for when it's time for some all-clad paints. And using quite a low air pressure on my airbrush, I start off with a metallic brass. Now this would cover just about all the armor. Then I used the metallic copper to blend in some shadows. In addition to masking off some segments that would split up the armor, and hopefully make the illusion of having several layers to it. For the blades, I used a combination of all-clad steel and dark aluminum. And when it's finished weathered in the end, I was hoping for a steel look rather than something chromy. Time will tell. And you probably know the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyways. Is Thanos blue, purple, or pink-ish? Pinkish. When you really look at the movies, he's never really one thing, is he? Anyways, I mixed up two base colors for the skin tone. That's right, two. I decided to go with painting two heads. They would be slightly different from each other, and that gives me the opportunity to try out some different techniques, knowing I could just pick the best one in the end. Once I had some experience with painting the head the right way, heads, I moved on to masking off and painting the rest of his body. Then came some shadows and highlights. I know it doesn't look quite right yet, but getting the skin just right. It's a slow process of building up the right color and texture. Some more highlights and shadows on the twins. Then I put the air pressure all the way down as far as it goes. This is to make the airbrush kind of spit out the paint in small drops. And the goal of this, of course, was to mimic all the small non-uniformed imperfections we have in our skin. I believe the term for this technique is actually called freckling, as in freckles. It kind of explains itself. But now it's time for some smaller details. Do you see how much I toned down the white color? It still looks like bright white. And although it looks like he's been eating marshmallows, I just had to make a bit of a mess to begin with, just to make sure I got a good coverage on all the details. It's an easy cleanup when it's fully dried. And in the end, this is how I like to do it. And using a fine brush, I added some more depth to his scars, and other places that made sense to me. They were starting to look pretty good at this point. And so far, this is my favorite. And that will leave this guy for some more testing. With everything done, I gave it a coat of varnish. Now that meant I could do some washes. No, not the burnt umber kind, but rather some white paint washes. This is to lighten up the skin tone a little bit, and at the same time preserving all the different layers of details. And as I mentioned, Thanos really isn't one color. It really depends on what scene you choose. For me, it's this one. It's the part from Infinity War when he returns to Titan, and ultimately wipes Tony's face with the planet. I'm getting closer, but I'm still not quite there yet. So while the paint was given some time to cure, I continued on with the armor. It's the really dark blue matte leather looking material I'm painting next. And in the beginning, I did spend some time on the masking, but I quickly decided that this would be faster and better by just using some acrylic paint, a brush and a steady hand. It's always like this. The first coat of acrylic paints, it doesn't really cover all that well, but it makes a huge difference with the second layer. And since this is a fast drying medium, all the 3 coats went on quickly, and it was looking good. Especially since the acrylics had a matte rubber kind of texture to it. Now that made for a nice contrast to the shiny metallic all-clad paints. For the blue metallic details, I did end up using some liquid masking. But you don't need all that much though. Just be careful to be precise, so you don't get any overspray. And yes, peeling off the masking is just as satisfying as it looks. It seems like Thanos has several slightly different looking armors, so I guess you can kind of pick and choose what goes where to make it look good. Yeah, still so satisfying. To make sure to seal in all the goodness, it was finished off with some all-clad aqua gloss. Then it's time to move on to the base again. For this, I went with some plain acrylic paints. And as usual, it starts with a base color. I do believe the color scheme of this would go perfectly with having the base consist of light brown limestones. That would mean some white, yellow, beige, and a creamy latte color. Throw some red in there, and you should have a Martian looking Titan planet for a display base. With the base coat done, varnished and fully cured, it was time for some washes. And yeah, this time it's the kind you're used to seeing. Some watered down black, burnt umber, sienna, a mix of yellows, reds and even some greens. The next part brings out not only the highlights, but it really shows off all the textures I've been building up. And if only I was better at using my camera correctly, or better at the lighting. You might better have seen that it's not only one shade of highlight, but rather a plethora of different colored light shades. Why? Well, because I believe it looks better. And secondly, I just love this part of the build. It's when you really start to get down to the small details, and you really get to have some fun with it. All of a sudden it looks a lot more interesting, and maybe even a little bit like Titan limestones. You can be the judge of that. But hold on, obviously there's more to come. Going back to my skulls again, which only had a base coat at this point. I finished them off by adding some more shadows and highlights, and a bit of washes and weathering to really show off the small details. And as usual, I kinda tested out the pieces together again. Again, just as a follow through, because I feel it's important to make it look good as a whole. There are lots of times you may have made something that just looks awesome, but when it's time to put it all together, it sorta just doesn't look right. It doesn't work out for some reason. Better to keep it in check while it's a work in progress. Which this time led me to make some small clay stones and other bits of smaller broken bones. This ultimately made the composition of the base a lot better looking. And since I was happy with all the placements, I glued it all down with some CA glue. You might have already noticed, but to even further elevate the look of things, I added some finely grained sand. First, I mix up a cup of Mod Podge with some water. I believe I usually use a 1:2 ratio. And I add a drop or two of some dishwashing soap. That makes it run smoother through the airbrush. And by applying thin coats of this glue mixture, followed up by spreading a thin layer of sand, I can pretty much build up the layers to make it more believable. Each layer cures pretty quickly, so when you flip it over, all the leftover sand should fall right off. If you want to, you can probably finish it off with some varnish at the end. It was almost time to start assembling it all, but first I wanted to lay down the first coat of weathering, or rather, painting on some more shadows and highlights. And using oil paints, you can certainly get those smooth transitions between the shades. I took a first pass at some details on the blades too. But I don't think I'll finish off this before it's all fully assembled. And speaking of putting it together, it was finally time. To make sure it all would hold together nicely, I used a combination of 2-part epoxy and some super glue. Well, not mixed together of course. But I put on a good coat of epoxy towards the middle of the piece, and then I used some super glue at the very edge of the part. I used the super glue just to make sure it's clamped down really hard and really fast. That's to make sure the epoxy is given time to fully cure. Because in my experience, super glue tends to give in over time, so this way, the epoxy will pretty much make sure it stays this way forever. And it was really exciting to finally see this big guy all put together. Hey there, buddy! It definitely ended up being a lot bigger than I imagined. And then comes the final stretch of this prop build. First, I give the skin some more shadows, highlights, dirt, and even some small scars. For this, I simply used some oil paints and some dry brushing. This really helps to mold or tone the muscles better. One of the benefits that comes with using oil paints is that you can lay it on pretty thin, almost like a filter in Photoshop. That means you keep all the previous detail work underneath. The same technique was used on the different parts of the armor, but by using a darker earthy color palette. It really took away the clean look and gave it some more life. And although I was very happy with how the display base turned out, here goes nothing. It just wasn't working as a whole. The color scheme was too light. And Thanos just didn't seem grounded enough, like he was floating on top of it. It's like I've said before, don't be afraid to take it further, or even sometimes starting all over. Luckily, it ended up looking a lot better after some darker washes, more sand and even some dirt. So, when I added the final details and weathering, and sort of tied it all together, it was definitely more difficult to work around this big prop, especially while also trying to get some good camera shots. In the end though, I might have skipped some parts on the helmet and the twin blades, but I do believe this video has gone on long enough now. So, like I usually say, that was the last bit of work I did on this prop build. That was it for this prop build. And maybe this is a good time to admit it, but I believe this is actually my first time painting a full body figurine, so I'm really proud of this one. And thank you so much for watching this. Make sure you subscribe and hit that bell, and I will try and share my next build with you. Have a great one, and again, thanks for watching.